Welcome to our fifth Cooper Assembly. For those of you who don't know me or Cooper, my name is Erin O'Connor. I am a developmental psychologist by training. I also direct the early childhood program at New York University, and I am chief of education here at Cooper. At Cooper, our goal is to help you make the most out of parenting. In addition to talks like today, we run parenting groups to help with the ups and the downs of parenting and everything in between. Our groups cover potty training to tantrums and everyone's favorite topic, sleep. And we are hopefully here to help give you those aha moments where things start to feel a little bit easier if they're feeling a little bit tough during parenting. So today we are thrilled to be joined by Lauren Vien, who is the education director at Rosen Rex. Lauren has extensive experience in early childhood and special education and over 10 years teaching experience in preschools prior to joining Rosen Rex. Lauren develops and runs classes for parents and is the author of Rosen Rex's best-selling Guide to Positive Language Strategies. She is also the mom to 2 young children. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lauren.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we are thrilled to have you here. So you and I speak a lot about goals when, working with parents, speaking with parents about really how to support positive connections between children and ourselves and the importance of it. But, as we all know, as parents and teachers, sometimes, especially during the toddler years, though, it can feel like there are these moments of disconnect. And this is something I know I talk a lot with parents about as well, where it's that desire to have this strong connection with your toddler in particular, but there often feels like there's this power struggle going on.
Right.
And in those moments, it feels hard, right? Sometimes to have that connection that we know is so important. So I love how your work focuses on really like the importance of positive language in forming, these relationships, both when there's conflict and when there's not.
Right.
Right. And in some ways prevent conflict by using positive language.
Right.
So
And
can you
sometimes
talk?
we're so focused, especially on the language piece, like we're so focused on the language in those challenging moments. And I mean, not always. Some days there's more challenging moments than neutral or positive moments. But a lot of times, if so much of the day isn't a tough situation, then we sort of lose those opportunities sometimes to be mindful about how we use those language to support our children when other things are happening. So I think, we'll talk about that sort of balancing out, how we prioritize our challenging moment language and our everyday language. For positive language, we can use the same approach no matter what the situation, but it is interesting in terms of connection, that we're so focused on like, oh, what did I say when that was happening? And then like when that has passed and you could be connecting with your child, then you're still feeling guilty about it, or you're wondering, but how to change that and it's past. So positive language, just so that, in terms of this conversation, we're all on the same page, is an approach where we can help children replace negative behavior with positive alternatives. And rather than emphasizing what not to do by telling your child, don't do this, you can't do that, or we don't do this, we can really teach our children what to do instead in those moments. And we can do that by using language prompting, or also by modeling language. So by showing and teaching our children what they can say in challenging moments. Sometimes, our children just can't access those words. And that's when we see physical behaviors, or lots of other things, but especially physical. So sometimes giving our children the words to say, you can tell that person, I'm sitting here, or I need more space. That's another aspect of positive language. So sometimes is clarifying our expectations. So, instead of telling our children, don't grab, for example, that's something that it's not wrong or bad to tell our children, don't grab. We're just emphasizing what not to do. So that's why it's considered negative language. And for something like that, when you say don't grab, you see your child reaching across and their hand is maybe on the other child's toy already. You say don't grab and it stops that particular grab maybe. But then the next time that your child has that same impulse of, I really want this toy, I really need what they have, they don't know what to do instead. So in that situation, I would say, so-and-so is using that, so-and-so's using this dump truck. I see the school bus and the race car are available. For a young toddler, I would probably give two choices of different things that they could use. For an older child, like my son is 6, there are still times, less often, but there are times when whatever is happening, there's like a little bit of impulse challenge there, So if there's a grab for an older child or a soon to be grab, I would say, his sister Violet is using that. You can choose something else or look to see what else is available. And the beauty of positive language is instead of emphasizing that negative, the don't grab, what not to do, by teaching them a strategy about what they can do instead. If you practice it in a variety of settings, you're at the library, they want someone else's book, you're in the sandbox, they want someone else's shovel. You use the same, this person's using it, please choose something else. This person's using it, you can use this or this. At 2, I joked with Erin recently, like everything our children need to know, they definitely learned from like shared New York City public playgrounds, because that's where we live. And there's like a lot of negotiating with stuff and space. And it's so good. It's a lot of work, but it's so good for them. And at 2, Henry, had practiced this grabbing strategy over and over again, where he was getting these soft cues from me to look around, see what's available. I could see his eyes light up. I knew what he really wanted. And even as a toddler, he eventually was able to walk into a space, look like he wanted something, and instead he could pause, scan the space with his eyes, and go to something that was available. So it's a great example of, when we teach our children what to do instead, there's going to be impulses, there's going to be limit testing. These are all developmentally appropriate toddler things. But when you really think about what they could do instead, that's the beauty of positive language. So that's sort of the mantra when you're sort of beginning this approach or trying to get back to this approach. Instead of telling them what not to do, tell them what they can do, tell them what they should do that will get their needs met.
Well, and I think, another thing I love about positive language is it's very research, supported, right?
Right.
Because when we think about where children are, and you and I talk about this a lot in terms of their self-regulation at this age, there's so much going on, right? There's your working memory, your shifting attention, like when you're in these situations, like we we're talking about, where you want a toy and another child has a toy. And if you already sort of know what you can do in that situation, it kind of takes some of the pressure off in terms of working memory and these, really core self-regulatory skills, versus if you know what you can't do, but you don't know what you should do.
Exactly.
A lot of anxiety and stress, right?
Yeah, that's, and that's something that, like, as adults in a workplace environment, again, like if you're telling someone what you need from them or what you expect of them, it's different than telling them what you don't want. Right. So it's like, it's much more confusing to a child. And we might think like, but our child understands so much language. And yes, they probably do. But if you're asking them to do two things, especially in a really challenging or stressful situation for them, you're asking them to stop whatever they're doing. And then you're asking them to immediately figure out what else to do. Whereas if you in a stressful situation can be a support by giving them that thing that they could or should be doing, then it's also just practice. Like if they eventually hear that in their ear when they're in a similar situation, we've given them something to pull from instead of like the absence of doing whatever they were doing. They know that they can do this thing or another thing, and that's considered safe or appropriate or kinder in that moment.
And I think it, also takes out potential conflict, right, between, the adult and the child, because if you have these expectations for your child's behavior and they don't know what those expectations are, right? Behavior can be misinterpreted as, oh, my child's not listening, or they're intentionally, quote unquote, acting out. Whereas right. It's not, right? It's just like, I'm not sure what to do in this moment.
Right. And there's going to be moments where even when we use positive language that, people will say like, well, I gave it a try and I told them what to do instead of what not to do, but they still did the thing that I didn't want them to do. But of course, like, it's not a magic fix. It just gives them so much more practice, so much more clarity, and it's more effective. If you look at all the times you said, don't do this, and all the times that you said, do this instead, you're more likely to see a positive result on the other side. But there's going to be, and we'll talk about that, because the big question that comes up, is limits. And, okay, so then what do I do next? So we can definitely talk about that. But I think that it's important to remember that they're getting like real chances to follow through and valuable opportunities to practice the what to do instead when we do it in the moment. There's a lot of benefit to having conversations with children after something happens. What could we do differently? Like, I definitely do that lots and lots. As an educator in my classroom, I did, and also with my own children, like that reflection piece, especially as older toddlers become, what we would consider like school age children. That is really important. The reflection of, oh, I noticed that this was challenging, or, what could we do differently next time? But there is something, especially for younger children, but even for older children, to practice in the moment. So instead of just like squashing something and not having our child do the other thing that they could be doing instead, to really go through it with them is helpful. Something like, in the classroom, I would see children lining up. Every time we lined up, there would be like a push here and there, or, squeezing in to try to get next to the person you want to be next to. And instead of me saying, don't push, or instead of me saying, I found you a better spot over here where you have more space, I would encourage them to figure it out by saying, you can tell that person, I need more space, or please push over, or you can look and see if there's another spot where your body would feel more comfortable. And that gives them that real-time practice of doing something instead. So I'm not just stopping the push, which of course would be one option. I'm letting them stop the push by saying, please, please move over, please, I need more space. Or telling them that another strategy is you can move yourself, but I don't want to do it for them, because I want them to have that practice every time there's a push over and over again, to have that strategy of, having their own personal boundaries met.
That's great. Yeah. And I think I like how you made that distinction of in the moment, because, so often for some things, right, we talk about how when children are worked up, that's not the time to have a in-depth discussion about something.
No, that's a good point. Yeah.
But for strategies like this, I think, like, as you're saying, figuring out in the moment what to do is a good learning opportunity. It's,
right.
if
Because we
that's
can talk about the strategy of what you could do instead. But of course, that feels less concrete. And the younger the child, thinking about something that happened even 30 minutes ago, a lot of things have happened since then. So having like real-time practice whenever it's safe to do so, whenever it's appropriate to do so. And I think especially parents, for the most part, like we try to be so respectful of like supporting our children in a way that, helps them feel good and doesn't make them feel like, ashamed, but you can do these things quietly. It doesn't have to be, everyone in the room doesn't have to notice that you're, prompting your child to find space for their body where they feel comfortable. You can do it in a way that feels the opposite of hovering, which I think is another benefit of positive language. Like, instead of you feeling like you have to be on the edge of your seat watching your child like a hawk, saying like, don't do this, don't do that, remember to be kind about this, remember to do this, you just see what happens. And when they need a prompt, you do it quietly or to the side, or if you have to talk about it afterwards because you feel like the opportunity wasn't there, then do that. But I think there are ways to do it where it doesn't feel like, sometimes in the beginning, when you're new to positive language, it might feel like you're talking a lot. Like, people sometimes wonder, well, how will they become independent when I'm not here if I'm not telling them what to do? But the thing is, at least if when you're there, you're telling them what to do, there's a chance that when you're not there, they will remember those conversations, they'll remember that practice, versus if we're there a lot, especially when they're younger, if they have a grown up there telling them what not to do, then when that person isn't there, they're more at a loss in those situations. So I think that when we are there, we can find respectful and quiet-ish ways to prompt or to remind them about language modeling. Tell that person I was using that. And it's not speaking for them, especially if we can encourage them to use that phrase on their own. I think that's important to remember too.
So I think we started to touch on this, but I know a question that often comes up is, boundary setting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the importance of boundary setting, but sometimes it can be, it can be a challenge as a parent, especially of a young child, to sort of figure out how to set those boundaries and how to do it in a way that is, comfortable for everyone involved.
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit more about, this sort of intersection with positive language and boundary setting?
Sure. Yeah, I think in those moments where we're, at a loss, especially, and we feel like, maybe you're in a phase of a lot of moments where you feel like, I just don't know what to do. Like, I feel like they're not listening to me. I think one benefit to positive language is that there's a clear goal as a parent. Like, you can tell yourself, my only goal right now in this phase or in this day or in this moment is to tell them what to do instead of what not to do. I'm going to help them replace whatever this negative behavior is with something more positive. And for me, I usually give like one original positive language statement. If my child is in a sandbox throwing sand, I'll say sand stays inside the sandbox. For a younger child, I would give them two options. You can scoop the sand and I would use a physical gesture, or you can sprinkle the sand. If I have a sense that they want to do something with their hands with the sand instead of with a tool, then I would make sure that I'm giving them, like, you can scoop it with your hand, you can sprinkle it with your hand, see if that gives them whatever sensory stimulation they need. I'll say it once. If it happens again, then I might, depending on how many times this is happening in our life lately, I might give the same two alternatives, or I might try something different. Instead of saying, don't throw sand the second time, I would say sand stays inside the sandbox. It looks like you need a tool, and they could try that. If it doesn't work again, after I've given a statement and a reminder, that's when I would move on to a meaningful consequence. And for me, positive language and meaningful consequences are like the partnership in terms of, boundary setting, when your child is testing limits. This is like where they sort of play together. So when I say meaningful consequence, I mean a consequence that's directly related to whatever behavior you're seeing. So your child is throwing sand, so it would not be a meaningful consequence to say, you're throwing sand, there's no dinner after dessert. No dessert after dinner tonight, like hours from now. It has to be related to the sand throwing. So I would say, I reminded you twice, sand stays inside the sandbox. Now it's time for you to leave the sandbox and choose somewhere else to play at the playground today. You can try again in the sandbox when we come here tomorrow afternoon. So I make it really clear that in this example, we're not leaving the playground, because you also, again, have to think about like what your child really needs. If my child needs to be outside and needs to be physical, it's not helping either of us for me to say, like, you're throwing sand, we're leaving the playground right now. No one was injured. Like that's a very serious consequence for me to leave an outdoor space where my children are getting what they need physically, because my expectations are not being met. So I would just be clear that they can play anywhere else they want, not sand, somewhere else. And that we will come back to the sandbox tomorrow, and that's when they can try again. It's not try again in 5 minutes. It's not try again after the slide. For me, I like to make things as concrete as possible. I try to stay away from minutes, hours, and make it really clear. You can try again after nap time. You can, try again after lunch. You can try again. For me, I might say tomorrow when we come, because we always come at the same time every day. So meaningful consequences are really going to help your child understand, okay, so my parent is telling me exactly what's expected of me. They're giving me two choices when I don't know what to do, and I'm still not choosing those things, or I'm still not trying those instead of, and now this is what's going to happen. So now I lose the opportunity to play in sand because I didn't play in sand in a way that is safe and appropriate. And when we do these things, our children are, sometimes people will say, well, my child will never make a choice. Like when they get stuck in these moments and I give them two alternatives, they don't want to make a choice. And that's often true, especially when we begin to give choices, if that's new to the child or the family. But children do learn that it's in their best interest to choose between the two options, because otherwise, like, we're going to have to choose for them, and they might really not like, what that consequence results in. And I think the follow through is important. Anytime it gets to that consequence point, like on my end, I always, hear endless apologies, or can I try one more time, or bargaining. And I very, very rarely like backtrack on a consequence. So you just kind of get the practice as a parent of making a meaningful consequence that is meaningful enough that doesn't ruin the afternoon. And every now and then I'll give a consequence that I'm like, oh, I wish I hadn't said that, because now it is really challenging for me and my child, but I really try to follow through. And I just tell myself, like, next time if this happens, I will not go there. Maybe I'll give them a third chance, or but I like this example of the sandbox, because I think that it's important to think about, if I just packed up and that was the consequence, then I would be bringing my child home who didn't have enough outdoor physical time. So then I'm likely going to encounter more challenges when I get home. Whereas if I can use this as a learning opportunity, that like sand is not an option, but you can go run and climb and do something else, then I've kind of checked both of those boxes.
Yeah, I love that example too, because I think, often your kind of first instinct is, okay, we'll just leave the entire situation. But
we might want to. We might be like, I am done with the sand and all things in this playground. But you learn after you've done it once that like you have to kind of try something in the middle.
Yes.
Same with like, I often talk about a meaningful consequence, like for bedtime stalling. Like if you've told your child it's time to brush your teeth, instead of like, don't, don't keep playing, or, if you're telling your child exactly what they know they should be doing and they're just not coming, they're laying on the floor, or they're like just continuing playing, then you could say, I reminded you twice that it was time to brush our teeth. Now tonight, instead of 2 bedtime stories like we always do, we have time for 1 bedtime story. And tomorrow night, I bet you'll come faster, and I know you can do it, and we'll have time for 2. Like, it's not 1 forever, it's just 1 for tonight. And I use that example again because in our home, like, we always do 2 bedtime stories instead of 1. Taking away 1 feels like they really don't like it. They want their 2 bedtime stories, but it's related to you spend time doing other things instead of what was expected of you. And because of that time, we don't have time to read 2. Like, we have to go to bed soon. I would never take away 2 books, because like if they had no books, there's like a huge disconnect in our regular routine. And I don't want to leave my children without the bedtime story. I'm sure there's been a night where like maybe there haven't been any books, but I'm sure it wasn't a good one, like it's like meaningful enough consequence, not and for the reason of them understanding, like, when I take too much time, then I don't get to read as much. It doesn't have to be seen as like a consequence, as a punishment, more as like a cause and effect relationship.
Which is so important, such an important skill, right? Throughout life. So learning that skill when you're young, of sort of managing and understanding cause and effect. I love how positive language allows you to do that from an early age.
Yeah.
So a question that I have sort of, I'm just thinking with my 2-year-old in particular, but also just speaking with other parents is, so you spoke about the importance of routine and not, breaking up the routine. When you're out, you're traveling, you're visiting grandparents, that kind of thing, and there is no routine. How do you kind of, have these meaningful consequences, sometimes in a more chaotic environment, if that makes sense, where, it's not as easy, quote unquote, easy as taking 1 book away. It's like, okay, we have to think of something that's going to be meaningful, but also is going to be respectful of a lot going on.
Right. I mean, I think then that's when you also, like, maybe there's less meaningful consequences in that situation, and more like acknowledging with your child. Like, my children now are 4 and 6. Like, I even said recently when we had visitors, like, quietly, again, respectfully, like, things feel really different this weekend. And like, we were reading books in a different room with different people. Like, we were in our home, but everything felt different. And it just was enough difference that it felt a bit chaotic. So I think, again, like, because we should follow through when we introduce a consequence, like, really pause and think about, like, do I need to offer a consequence here? Or can I just kind of go with this and say to my child, like, this is a different kind of bedtime today. Here's how we're going to do it today. Or, I see that this feels challenging for you. I'm going to help you. Like, maybe you normally encourage your child to get dressed And that is not happening because there's a lot going on. So you say like, I'm going to help you get dressed today. And I think that will help us have enough time to read. Just sort of like allowing ourselves as parents to know that one weekend, one week, one visit is not going to derail everything that we've put into this routine that really works for us as a family. And routines do not work forever. So likely, even if it does disrupt it a bit, our child was going to would need a shift eventually anyways. Does that make sense?
That's a good point. So do you find that sometimes it's hard to get everyone involved in a child's life on the same page around positive language?
Sometimes. Yeah. I think that, depending on how many people we have in our circle who are like actively caring for our children on a regular basis, um, those are the people that I would say, like, I'm very conscious and passionate about using positive language. My partner is on board, so that's a benefit. It takes some time. We have some difference in style. We have like very different ways that we were raised and spoken to as children. Um, but I think that seeing and feeling how natural it can feel has helped my husband, kind of have his own version of positive language with our kids. I think in the beginning he was worried it would feel like censoring, like he would feel like, I want to tell my child, don't do this thing that you could crack your head open if you do. And instead I'm going to be taking that time to like, make the shift in my head. Like that doesn't make sense to me. But I think the more practice he's gotten. Also, in an educational setting, a lot of times people will use positive language to talk about what things are for, instead of what children can do instead. So for example, like if a child is standing on a chair in a classroom, like what I always heard as a teacher was other teachers saying, chairs are for sitting, instead of like, I might say to the child, please sit down on your chair. And both are great, right? Like one teaches them like what things or what your environment should really be used for and how to safely use these things in your environment. I think it's more specific and sometimes like easier for a child to understand when we just tell them like what to do on that chair. Instead of saying like, don't stand in your stroller or don't kneel in your stroller, which often happens as I'm walking down the street, I see and hear and like vaguely remember our stroller days. Just instead saying to your child, like, please sit safely on your bottom, or please sit in your stroller, instead of strollers over sitting. So I think Ben also, my husband, had heard some of these like, phrases, and he felt like I would never say that. So you find what works for you, but you just remember the idea is, what to do instead here. And then in terms of, extended family, not everyone is going to communicate in the same way. So I think, again, you have to think about your relationship with the adults in your child's life, how open you feel you can be or want to be. I think a lot of times if we lead with, here's something I learned about positive language, I would love for us all to practice it. Or here's something I've been trying, even if you've been doing it for a long time and it's something that you feel like pretty confident in, saying to your family, like, here's something I've been trying. And I noticed that she listens better when I tell her what to do instead of what not to do. And Erin and I have spoken about how, there's more to it than just getting our children to listen. Like that's not, my biggest love about positive language. I do think that it improves behavior generally, but there's more to it in terms of like setting children up to be confident and independent and resolve strategies, resolve problems more independently. But when you're explaining it to someone who does not know positive language at all, it can be easier to say, she listens better when I tell her what to do or instead of what not to do, because it clarifies the expectations. And also sharing, articles, things that you're reading. If you have that kind of relationship with people in your life who care for your children or spend a lot of time with them, sometimes it takes that like a little bit of a power struggle away if you can sort of lean on an educator, an expert, instead of saying like, I know that this is what we should be doing. It's like, here's what research says, or here's something I found really interesting. And also you can decide when to just embrace that most of the time your children will be spoken to in a certain way by the people who spend the most time with them. And other times they'll learn that even people they love communicate differently. It's not bad or wrong to communicate differently. It's different. My son is like sensitive to nuances of language, probably because like, you know, we're very mindful of our language. So certain things will bother him. And then it's up to me as the parent to teach him that, you know, when an occasional babysitter says, when your sister gets hurt, don't cry to your sister, it's not because she is rushing her feelings or, you know, telling her that crying isn't allowed. It's that it's her way of comforting your sister. It's like when I say, I'm here, you're safe, some people say, don't cry. It doesn't mean you're not allowed to cry. It just means she wants your sister to feel better. So little things like that, trying to show that we're on the same page as those other adults, even if they don't speak exactly like us.
And I think that's such an important point too, about showing that we're on the same page, and how children sense a comfort level, right, that we have with other people who are with them, who are taking care of them. And I think sometimes if it feels like their language being used is very different and we don't explain that to them, that, you know, it's the same underlying intent, right, that it can be
Right.
confusing.
Yeah, and it could show that there is a disconnect there. I think that that's something that kids pick up on that can be a little bit scary or sometimes just interesting to them. It's like when your child will say, you know, oh, well, dada does it like this, or, you know, grandma doesn't do it this way. Like they notice these differences. I think sometimes like in our situation, like if my children being cared for by someone who has a very different approach to a situation that I speak differently about, then I want to show that there's different ways to approach it. And I like that there's an openness there, that if he hears something that bothers him, that he'll talk about it and we can kind of figure that out together. And also, you know, between peers, as children get older, you might hear your child complain that they don't like the way, you know, a child spoke to them. And it's a good conversation to have with our kids, you know. Not that I would use the phrase like, oh, well, if you don't like the way they say that to you, that's good to remember so you don't say it to someone else, but just saying like, how did that make you feel and what exactly bothered you about that? With a 6-year-old, I can go there, you know, with a 4-year-old, no, you know, she might say, this person said this. And I would say, you know, what do you think they could have said instead? And what did you say? Oh, you didn't say anything. So next time, if it happens, what will you say? And that's a good way to model after the fact, because I'm not there, you know, where as your children get older, you're like further and further away from these challenging peer situations sometimes. So it's like when you get the practice, when you're with them in the sandbox, then you have to move to those, you know, after the fact practice sessions.
Yeah. So something that we like to talk about sometimes at Cooper, and you know, thinking about is how our work influences our parenting and sort of vice versa. So, you know, I'd love to hear a little bit about, we've touched on this a fair amount, but how your experiences have sort of informed how you parent, and also maybe how just being a parent has informed your work as well.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I think that coming from a place of like diving into child development and you know what typically you might see at certain ages is really helpful information as an educator who then becomes a parent. You know, this awareness of like behavior comes from a child's need is something that really informs positive language, especially, you know, this idea of like, we could say don't run in the house because we don't have space to run in our New York City apartment. But if my child really has that physical need to run, like what can they do instead? And can we build, like in the classroom, we would build a repertoire of, you know, it's a rainy day, we're not going outside to the yard, but we certainly are going to move our bodies. So things like that, you know, then you kind of build this, I see your body really needs to move. Let's march to a dinosaur song. Let's roll across the rug. Like having sort of a bag of tricks that not a teacher, any parent could do this as well, but just that frame of mind of, okay, whatever I'm seeing is because of either a physical need or an emotional need. So like, what can I give them to do instead that's going to check that? Like, you know, I can't just stop that from happening because they're not going to get what they need and I'm just going to see something challenging somewhere else. So that kind of awareness and that frame of thinking is really helpful as a parent. And I think too, like, you know, learning and being a teacher in training, learning that, perfection is not even the goal, that our children really learn from watching us make what we would consider mistakes and acknowledging those mistakes. The idea that 7 out of 10 things a child hears during the day should be positive instead of negative is helpful. It was helpful as a teacher who wanted to get everything right and felt such responsibility with young children in supporting them and building them up. And as a parent, to reflect on the day as a whole, like we talk so much to our kids and we get stuck, or I get stuck on like the 20 minutes where I said lots of things in a tone that wasn't great, or, one thing that I said that I was like, "Ooh, that certainly was not my best." But if I think about all the things that I said during the day, 7 out of 10 is doable. Like 10 out of 10 is not, but that's not even like the gold standard for educators. They need to see us and hear us use a tone that, you know, is not what we would do in our best moment. So then afterwards we can talk about that with them. I'm sorry I used an angry voice. I was feeling frustrated because it was taking so long to get out the door today. Not blaming my children, but telling them like what I was feeling and why, and acknowledging that I used an angry voice or a loud tone, or however you choose to describe it. And starting from like baby saying these things, because we've spoken about, if receptive language comes so much quicker than expressive, your child might not be able to say these things back to you, but they're listening to you. So even at 1.5, I would say, if I like lost my cool, I would say to my baby who wasn't talking back to me, I'm sorry, mama used a loud voice. I was feeling this because of this. And I think that that is something that has been really helpful to do in terms of, my children have heard authentic apologies. And I hear them sort of when they want to tell me something that they've done, they'll try to think about the why.
That's great.
And not in an excuse way either, like in a way that's like, here's what I think might be going on. And sometimes they'll say, I don't know. I don't know why I spoke that way. Like my 6-year-old will say like, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time being nice to Violet or speaking kindly to Violet. And I'll say like, it's okay not to know, but you noticed it and you feel it, you hear it, like, okay, let's figure out what we need to do before we, go into the same room and speak again. I think that like one of the benefits of teaching is like that reflection piece that like, especially if you work as a team, I was always like a team teacher. So it's amazing to like have these opportunities to be in it. So much happens, and then have like, a few minutes even at the end of the day to be like, okay, what was that? What was going on here? What did you see? What did I say? And it kind of just helps you get quick at reflecting. Because as a parent, like I don't have time at the end of the day or in between things with my kids to spend an hour thinking about what I could have said differently. But even just a pause here and there is helpful.
It's so funny that you said that, because I was thinking as you were speaking, I was like, reflection. That's to me like what keeps coming up with
Yeah.
that importance of reflection.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think too, like, one thing about getting people on the same page with our guide to positive language strategies, we recently added a workbook component that you can share either with your caregiver or your partner or even yourself. And again, not like a huge labor intensive, like everyday journaling about what you're saying to your children, but just that reflective piece that's sometimes missing. Like sometimes we consume so much like amazing information and we have these goals of like, I want to do that, but to see things broken down is really helpful. Everyone who's watching the video and registered for this will get like a PDF of helpful tips for positive language to start up as a family. But in addition, like this workbook component was something that I was really passionate about adding, because I feel like sometimes it's hard to put these things into practice. And sometimes just having someone help you say, like, what one phrase are you going to work on this week? Instead of thinking every single time you say, don't do this to your child, you have to switch it to something they can do. Like, what's something that that you say a lot that you'd like to say something different? Sometimes just like a very tiny baby step and one phrase can make a big change in like how your family feels in terms of power struggles.
And so important. I think, like you're saying, it's not, you're not going to change everything in one day, right? That,
Right.
the brained behaviors that some of us have, but we can just,
Right.
baby steps here and there, and then it
Right.
becomes more of a pattern.
And it doesn't have to be a complicated scripted language approach. I think just knowing that if the one thing you try to do is show your children what they can do or should do in challenging situations instead of what they shouldn't be doing, like that's more than enough here. There's times where, yes, we want to be like really careful about phrasing and how we present things. This is really just like a way of shifting whatever you're already saying into something that is different words but means the same thing. It's putting an end to whatever you see, but in a way that you're helping them do something else. And I say, like, we joked about this, that like it's something you can do as toddlers, and we should. And then also, like, it carries through to teenagers. It feels different to our children and to us when we're saying what they can do instead of what not. Like, our children are going to feel, especially as they get older, that we're sort of on top of them about, like, I say Henry is like 6 going on 16. He leaves his dirty laundry in like really weird, gross places, like under couch pillows, and instead of saying like, don't put your socks here, I just say like, please put your socks in the hamper before you go to school. And I still, in my mind, am like so grossed out, but I'm trying to say it in a way that's like, this is just what you need to do, instead of like, why do you always put them here? Like, what I'm really thinking in my head is like, why do I find dirty clothes in all strange tucked in spots all over our home? That's so gross. But if I just tell him instead, like, oh, grab this here before you do this, it just feels different. He still, of course, doesn't want to do it, but I know that it hasn't escalated to like, well, I don't always do that. I didn't do it yesterday, So I think that that's been helpful too. And I kind of can see, like, I get glimpses now as he's like a tiny bit older, where he just seems so past the toddler phase, but these strategies are still helping, still working. And it's amazing to see him be like independent in the way he can resolve stuff and tricky stuff.
I also think, as the parent of a teen and thinking about sort of
Oh,
using
you're like, yeah, you're actually with a teenager. That's so different.
I'm actually with a teenager, which I can't believe, but I am.
6 to me is like so big.
Oh yeah. 6 to me was so big. Now I'm like 14, like, oh, this is crazy big. But with, I feel like with a teenager too, something that, the more and more as we've been talking about positive language, I've been more aware too of using it with my older daughter, but it's also making me think about what is important for me that she does, right? So it's like, instead of just saying, get off the phone or whatever it is, it's like, okay, well, is it the phone that I really want her to get off of, or it's actually, I want her to do something with her younger sister, and
Right.
being clear about that and having to be clear has made me be more reflective, I think.
That's so interesting. I think also, like, in that, you could tell her to get off the phone 8 times, or you could one time talk to her about how maybe one time this week you and your younger sister could do something special this afternoon, right? Like, instead of it feeling so repetitive, which then escalates to them feeling like we're talking at them or we're constantly telling them what to do or what not to do, we can sort of be clear about our goal. Like, what's really important to me is that you have a bit of time with your sister.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes it really different. I have to take all the notes for the actual teenage years.
Actually, I have to say they've been wonderful so far, but
that's awesome. That's great to hear.
I'm anxious that,
Yeah, but it's all changing all the time. So
all changing all the time. So true. Well, Lauren, I'm cognizant of time, and thank you so much for all the time given. I know folks are going to want to learn more about you. So, just for our audience that's listening, roseandrex.com is the website, and then on Instagram at roseandrex.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can always shoot me an email at my personal address. Also, it's just Lauren, LAUREN @roseandrex.com. And feel free to reach out. I work with families individually or groups of parents that want to do workshops together. So happy to keep in touch and sort of field some individualized questions.
Great. Well, this was recorded due to a recording error when we did this live. So thank you all for watching this. And for those of you who might have joined and are watching it as well. But just before you go, as I mentioned before, I'm Chief of Education for Cooper, and a little bit sort of more about Cooper is our goal is to form a real judgment-free group environment for parents to come together and really make connections around things that are meaningful to them and their children. So these groups meet virtually and they meet once a month, although you have an opportunity to meet with the folks who run your group, in between meetings, and also to send email questions and be involved with chats with them. And then there are other activities like workshops that we do and assemblies like you were a part of today. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lauren.
Bye.